Crass is my guest on Truthout Interviews. He's a dad, an author, social justice organizer, and he speaks about anti-racist organizing, feminism, liberation, and he's also a contributor to Truthout, whose most recent post is entitled Feminist Father's Day 2014. Hello, Chris. Welcome to Truthout Interviews.
All right. Thank you so much for having me.
In your book, which is called Towards Collective Liberation, Anti-Racist Organizing, Feminist Praxis, and Movement Building Strategy, you found out a very hard truth about yourself from one of your friends, and that is, you're a sexist. How did that feel?
Well, yeah, it was one of both the most powerful moments in my life in terms of personal growth and transformation. And in the moment, it felt horrible. It was this devastating statement that was shared with me in a very loving and compassionate and thoughtful way from person I was working with very closely, doing activism work, and also, dating at the time. And, we were doing activism. And I think for a lot of people who come into social justice work, at first there's a real consciousness of what it is that we're opposed to, economic inequality, war, various kinds of systems of oppression, capitalism, white supremacy, so on. But then over time, it starts to get more complicated, realizing the ways that one is also part of those systems. And so for myself, my friend holding my hand saying, I need to talk with you about your sexism was at the time really devastating because it challenged my sense of who I was. I'm a good guy. I'm an activist. I believe in social justice. I'm against rape culture. But then she started talking about all these examples of men not making eye contact with women in meetings, men ignoring women's ideas over and over and over again in conversations, in decision-making conversations, but then maybe repeating a woman's idea 20 minutes later as their own, and other men being like, oh, wow, what a great idea, to women not being trusted to take on leadership in the group. It's a whole range of daily ways of being, of ways that leadership and ideas aren't supported or are supported depending on one's gender. All these different ways. All of these things were devastating to hear. And I was in denial. I had a whole playbook about there's no way I can be sexist. I'm progressive, kind of playbook all of a sudden downloaded in my head. But then over time, when then she brought it to the whole group and other men started having the same kind of reaction, it was this realization, and then other women starting to share their experiences. It was this realization that, my friend Nilu, she was saying, I'm not saying you guys are particularly bad people. I'm saying that patriarchy is a system and that you as men perpetuate it in various ways, whether you choose to or not, but you need to start choosing to be feminists. And so it was a horrible experience being told that I was sexist. But it was ultimately an incredibly liberating and transformative experience, particularly the more men listened to women, looked to women's leadership around feminism, and committed to making a change. And ultimately, it was a change that has profoundly changed my life in beautiful ways.
When I was in college, I studied a lot about social movements, especially during the 60s, and even more specifically about the New Left. The New Left had almost the identical problem, that they were about liberation, about changing society, about changing even the way in which men and women, gender roles, sort of smashing gender roles. But yet the men lapsed into sort of stereotypical male roles. They expected the women to fetch coffee, to type up the papers. And it's interesting, you flash forward, and I'm guessing that this may have been in the early 2000s and the 90s when you found out, when you had this, when this happened. But you flash forward 30 plus years later, and the same sort of things recur.
There's been tremendous gains and advances as a result of movements from the 60s and 70s, and a lot of being able to look back at, particularly women of color feminist writing that really talks about sexism in, movements that are male dominated, racism in movements that are white dominated, really looking at how can we think about our politics in ways that centers the experiences of those who are at the cross sections of oppression, and then how does that change our agendas, our strategy, our vision, and then ultimately how does that impact our culture and the ways that we are in the world, So there's a lot of really important, just as you were mentioning, lessons and insights that we gain from past movements. And there's a lot more sophistication thinking about gender and sexuality because of the transgender liberation movement, because of the queer liberation movement, because of feminist movement. So my generation and those generations younger inherit a tremendous amount of insight and lessons, as well as strategies. But one of the key problems I think facing activists today and in society in general is that conversations about sexism and racism are often really focused on individual behavior detached from structural and historical systems of power. And so the conversation with my friend Nilu, for example, was really important because what she was saying was not just that you need to change your sexism in a way that implied that I am personally responsible for sexism, but she was really able to articulate there's a system of power that's developed over time called patriarchy. And that means that male supremacy, male privilege are a part of our society. And so you need to choose if you're going to perpetuate it unconsciously or consciously, or to act against it, both in terms of personal behavior and group dynamics within activist work, but also in terms of working for structural change around the ways that women's unpaid reproductive labor is so much at the heart of how capitalism operates the economy, households in general. And so policies around like supporting domestic worker organizing in the country, supporting minimum wage increases, supporting worker organizing, supporting the expansion of public service systems of food stamps, welfare, early child learning programs that basically come from working class communities' money, but have been dismantled, austerity measures that have dismantled welfare, dismantled so many of the public support systems that we as working class people, middle class people have built over the decades. So many of those kinds of systems, support structures have been dismantled, and then that money being siphoned up towards the richest class in society.
You're getting back to something that you alluded to earlier, a group dynamic. You're raising a son, and you told me he's a toddler. He's about 3 years old. You obviously take him to out and about and to playgrounds and maybe play dates and so forth. What do you see in terms of the group dynamics between little boys and little girls on the playground that's different now, or even this, or is there any difference at this point in terms of the way the children are getting socialized about and how they either lapse into their gender roles or it gets reinforced by their parents or even by the group dynamic?
It's a beautiful thing having a little person and really trying to bring these ideas around feminism and socialism and these different kinds of ideas into okay, how do we also create then family culture and a magical childhood for my son River, where I want him to grow up to be loved and supported, and to grow up with lots of role models of feminism and anti-racism and social justice. And so on the playground, I mean, I think one of the most important things is less kind of what are the little kids doing and kind of more what are the adults doing. And in a lot of ways, men being much more involved because of feminist movement. I mean, feminist movement for decades was calling for and trying to support men to be more emotionally involved in the lives of their families and their children, being able to share more of the household responsibilities, the reproductive labor. And so I think kids, the more and more kids are able to see men doing everything from laundry to dishes to being at the playground. Absolutely. I mean, I think right now there's a lot of men who are looking for more resources, and so two of them this is a really fantastic book by Bell Hooks, really written to men about feminism and what feminism can mean in the lives of men. And the ways that men are hurt by sexism and patriarchy. So this is a really fantastic book, The Will to Change Men, Masculinity, and Love by Bell Hooks. And then this is a really incredible book by Paul Kivel called Men's Work that really goes deep into the ways that violence, the ways that patriarchal violence really hurts men, and then how that gets then brought into our families and in our relationships and communities. And so a lot of the work that men can do to heal and recover from violence and also bring more of a peaceful, cooperative, loving way of being into our communities and lives.
Well, Chris, I want to thank you for being on the program.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Chris Crass is a contributor to Truthout and the author of the book Towards Collective Liberation, Anti-Racist Organizing, Feminist Praxis, and Movement Building Strategy. You can read an excerpt of the book on Truthout. And thanks for watching Truthout Interviews. I'm Ted Asregadoo. See you next time.